He humiliated and dismissed every maid. No one could tolerate his cold personality. However, one simple girl accomplished what seemed impossible. Please remember to subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching this video. Subscribe to the channel and write where you are watching this video. The mansion loomed like a monument to silence, its marble halls echoing not with laughter, but with the hollow cadence of footsteps and the low hum of a grandfather clock that seemed to measure time more sternly than any human voice could. From the outside, it stood as a fortress of wealth, every column and stone carefully selected to declare supremacy. Inside, it was a world where warmth had no place. The walls gleamed, polished daily until they shone like mirrors, yet they reflected nothing of human life. To serve in this house was to move like a shadow, silent, precise, and fearful of every sound that might displease the man who owned it. Alexander Huntington, the master of this domain, was a man whose presence alone froze entire rooms. At 38, he carried himself like someone sculpted out of granite, his tall frame always wrapped in tailored suits, his expression unreadable, but for the sharpness of eyes that seemed to pierce through excuses before they were spoken. Everything about him was deliberate, his stride, the measured turn of his head, the way he held a glass or adjusted his cufflinks. His wealth was not new money, but the ancient kind, inherited through generations of cunning investments and ruthless decisions. Yet Alexander had added his own mark, multiplying the fortune with precision and discipline. To him, people were not companions or equals. They were assets to be managed, like stocks to be traded, employees to be replaced when they faltered. The staff knew this all too well. Whispers circulated in the servants' quarters about those who had been dismissed for minor errors. One maid had folded a napkin incorrectly during a dinner for foreign diplomats. She was gone by morning. A chauffeur who once arrived 3 minutes late to the airport was dismissed before the car cooled. Fear governed the mansion as effectively as locks or contracts. Even the head butler, who had served 2 generations of Huntingtons, moved with the nervous respect of a man who had seen many colleagues cast out without hesitation. Into this house of order and dread had come Amelia, a young maid no older than 24. She was new enough that some of the older servants pitied her, certain she would not last the month. Her dark skin and kind smile made her stand out in an environment that valued invisibility. She was not meek in the way others were. She was gentle but not fearful. She greeted others in the servant halls, asked about their families, shared her bread with those who had worked too long to eat. Her life outside the mansion was a stark contrast to the opulence around her. She lived in a cramped room on the outskirts of the city, supporting a mother who rarely left her bed and 2 younger brothers who still dreamed of futures she could barely afford. For Amelia, every coin mattered. Every long shift was a lifeline for her family. It was this duality, opulent coldness within the walls and struggling warmth outside, that gave her a quiet strength. She had no time for pride or for fear. Her hands were already worn from years of cleaning, cooking, scrubbing, caring. To her, work was survival, and she bore it with a smile that sometimes unsettled the others. They could not understand how anyone could carry kindness into this house of frost. Alexander first noticed her not during a formal introduction, but in a moment so small he would later question why it lingered in his memory at all. He had been crossing the garden one afternoon, inspecting the arrangements for an upcoming dinner with foreign investors, when his eyes caught the figure of Amelia bending to pick up a small scrap of paper carried by the wind. It was nothing an envelope that had slipped from someone's pocket, yet she knelt, brushed dirt from the grass, and tucked the paper away to discard properly. Her actions were slow, deliberate, with no audience. She did it not because anyone was watching, but because she seemed to believe even disorder in the garden was worth correcting. He paused just briefly and found himself frowning. Most servants hurried about, trying to please him or to avoid his gaze altogether. She acted as if her work had a purpose beyond his approval. That evening, as the house settled into its usual hush, Alexander stood in his study, the room lined with dark wood and shelves of law and finance, contracts that built empires. He poured himself a glass of wine, though he barely tasted it. His mind returned against his will to the vision of a maid brushing dirt from paper, as though tidiness had meaning independent of him. The thought irritated him. It was foolish. sentimental, and yet it persisted. The next morning, during the routine inspection of the dining hall, his gaze found her again. She was polishing silverware, humming under her breath. The melody was faint, soft, and not quite in tune, but it carried something unfamiliar into the cold air of the hall. Warmth. He watched her without speaking, and when she finally noticed him, she stilled immediately, bowing her head like the others. He gave no remark, merely continued his round. But again that faint sense of dissonance troubled him. The servants whispered among themselves later that day. "He looked at her," said one, "as if he was thinking." They laughed nervously, for they had all learned that the master's thoughts rarely meant anything good for those in his employ. Amelia, however, did not think of it at all. For her, the day was measured not by glances, but by the ache in her hands and the count of coins she could send home. She returned to her small rented room that night and wrote a letter to her mother, telling her not to worry, that she was safe, that work was steady. She did not mention the coldness of the house or the way laughter died at its doors. She described instead the gardens, the way the roses caught the sunlight, the way chandeliers scattered light into rainbows on the floor. For Amelia, beauty was worth noticing, even in a house that seemed determined to choke it. Meanwhile, Alexander remained in his study long after midnight, reviewing ledgers and contracts, his mind sharper than any blade. Yet when he closed his eyes, the numbers blurred, and he saw instead a maid bending to gather a scrap of paper, humming as she polished silver. He dismissed it with a shake of his head, but the image would not leave him. Something was shifting in the house, though neither master nor servant yet knew it, and so the ice remained unbroken, but hairline cracks began to form. In the days to come, one fragile moment would test them all, and Alexander Huntington, master of discipline and control, would learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world was not betrayal or loss, but kindness offered without expectation. The evening had unfolded with all the precision of a theater performance. The chandeliers, dripping with crystal, cast a rain of light across the banquet hall, turning polished marble floors into a stage where every gesture was meant to impress. Waiters moved like clockwork, their trays balanced high, carrying glasses that glistened with champagne. The orchestra played softly in the corner, notes weaving through conversations about markets, mergers, and politics. For Alexander Huntington, such evenings were as ordinary as breathing. He stood at the head of the long dining table, tall and commanding, his presence drawing deference without his needing to speak. To the staff, however, the atmosphere was suffocating. Each of them knew that the smallest misstep could cost a career. A glass set down too loudly, a dish served too cold, or a crease in a napkin could bring down Alexander's icy judgment. They had all seen colleagues vanish from the mansion in the dead of night after some minor blunder. Tonight, the tension was even higher than usual. Foreign dignitaries were among the guests, men and women whose approval could mean millions in contracts. Amelia had been stationed discreetly near the far end of the hall, ready to assist the more senior maids when called. She moved quietly, her gaze lowered, her hands folded. Unlike the others, however, there was no trembling in her movements. She was not fearless, but she had long ago learned that fear wasted strength. She conserved hers for the endless hours of labor that awaited at both the mansion and her own home. The incident began with a sound so slight most missed it at first, the delicate slip of a silver tray against a nervous hand. A waiter's knuckles whitened as he struggled to keep hold, but the balance failed. A glass toppled, then another. The tray tilted, and champagne flutes clattered to the floor in a spray of golden liquid and shards. The orchestra faltered for a note, conversation stuttered into silence, and all eyes turned toward the commotion. At that precise moment, Alexander shifted his arm with sudden irritation. Whether at the noise or at some stray thought that displeased him, no one knew. His hand brushed against the tall vase at the edge of the table. A French crystal piece, imported at enormous cost. It teetered, then crashed to the marble with a sharp explosion of sound. Shards scattered in every direction, sharp and glittering under the chandelier's glow, like fallen stars. The room froze. Not a servant dared move, not a guest dared speak. Everyone knew what usually followed. Alexander Huntington's wrath was legendary, and it often fell not just on the one who erred, but on anyone within reach. The waiter who had dropped the tray stood rooted in place, pale and trembling. Amelia, however, did not hesitate. She stepped forward before thought could stop her. The others watched, wide-eyed, as she knelt among the shards. With bare hands, she began gathering the broken crystal, her fingers shaking, not from fear, but from the sting as sharp edges sliced into her skin. Red drops appeared against the white marble, a stark contrast to the golden champagne that pooled around them. She winced but did not stop, whispering apologies not for herself, but for the mess left in her master's sight. Alexander's eyes narrowed as he watched her. At first he expected the usual display, servants scrambling to avoid punishment, stammering excuses, or pleading for forgiveness. But this was different. Amelia did not try to explain, nor did she cower. She simply worked, heedless of pain, her only focus on restoring order. Blood smeared the crystal fragments as she placed them carefully on the tray she had fetched. "Stop," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the silence. The single word rang with such authority that even the orchestra stilled mid-note. Amelia froze, startled, her dark eyes lifting to meet his. For the briefest moment, something passed between them, something that unsettled him. He was accustomed to seeing fear in the eyes of his staff. Her gaze, however, was not fear but confusion, as if she could not understand why he would interrupt her simple act of service. "You'll ruin your hands," he said more quietly, his tone sharper than he intended. "It's only a scratch, sir," she murmured, lowering her gaze again. Her voice was soft, steady, uncomplaining. She reached for another shard, and crimson welled across her fingertip. Before Alexander could speak, the head butler hurried forward, bowing low. "I will see to this, sir. The girl meant no offense." "Fetch the physician," Alexander ordered, his tone leaving no room for protest. Gasps rippled through the staff. A physician for a maid? Never had such a command been given in the Huntington household. Normally, injuries among servants were patched with bandages, if at all, and their pain was regarded as the price of employment. But Alexander's gaze remained fixed on Amelia as the butler scurried away. Amelia flushed, clearly embarrassed. "That's not necessary," she whispered, rising slowly to her feet. Her palms, marked by thin lines of red, trembled slightly, but she clasped them together to still the motion. "I only wish to bleed on my floor?" he interrupted, but the words lacked the venom he usually wielded. Instead, they sounded strained, as though his usual armor had cracked. He gestured sharply, and two servants rushed to finish clearing the shards. The guests, sensing the moment was delicate, resumed their conversations, though more subdued. Yet many eyes lingered, curious. To see Alexander Huntington break his rhythm was like witnessing marble bend. When the physician arrived, Amelia tried to step aside, insisting she could wash and wrap the cuts herself. But Alexander's voice was cold steel. "Do as I say." The doctor worked quickly, cleaning and bandaging the cuts. Amelia stood silent, her head bowed, though her cheeks burned with shame. She could not understand why her small act had become a spectacle. To her, she had only done what any person should, clean the mess, regardless of who made it. When the physician finished, Alexander dismissed him with a curt nod. He turned back to Amelia, his eyes unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he said, "You may return to your duties tomorrow. For tonight, rest." She opened her mouth to protest. "Sir, do not argue." Her lips closed, though her eyes flickered with unspoken words. She bowed and retreated toward the servants' wing, her steps light despite the throbbing pain in her hands. The banquet continued, but something in the air had shifted. Among the staff, whispers spread like wildfire. Never had their master stayed his wrath in such a way. Never had he concerned himself with the pain of a maid. The incident became a legend before the night was even over. Alexander, however, felt no triumph. He returned to his study after the last guest departed, pouring himself another glass of wine. He stared at it for a long time, but when he raised it to his lips, the taste was bitter. His mind returned again and again to the sight of crimson drops on marble, the quiet determination in Amelia's eyes as she worked through pain without complaint. He told himself it meant nothing. She was a servant. Her hands were tools. And yet he could not banish the thought that there was something more in her act than duty, something he could not name. For the first time in years, Alexander Huntington found his thoughts unsettled. And though the mansion returned to silence, its master no longer felt the same unshakable control within its walls. The morning after the banquet dawned, with the same calculated precision that always defined the Huntington estate. The staff moved quietly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets, their hands quick to dust, polish, and arrange. Yet under the surface, a tremor of excitement rippled. Whispers darted through the servant halls like restless birds. Alexander Huntington had ordered a physician for a maid, for Amelia. It was an act so unprecedented, so uncharacteristic, that the staff could scarcely contain their astonishment. "Did you see his face?" one footman murmured in the pantry. "He looked troubled." "Troubled? Our master?" A maid scoffed, though her eyes were wide with disbelief. "He's stone-carved into a man. He doesn't trouble himself with anyone's pain." "And yet," another chimed in, lowering his voice, "he did." The stories grew with each retelling, exaggerated into legend before Amelia herself had risen from her bed. Some said the master had shouted at the doctor to work faster. Others claimed he had reached out to hold her hand while the wounds were dressed. By breakfast, the entire staff believed that something extraordinary had happened in the banquet hall. Amelia, for her part, thought nothing extraordinary at all had occurred. She awoke with her palms bandaged, the dull throb of cuts pulsing beneath the wrappings. The physician had left her a small jar of ointment, which she set aside to share later with the cook, whose joints often ached from the constant strain of stirring and chopping. To Amelia, pain was a familiar companion, not a spectacle. She had endured worse carrying water jugs in her childhood, washing linens until her fingers cracked, scrubbing until her knuckles bled. She bore the soreness with a quiet sigh, tied her hair neatly, and slipped into her uniform. When she appeared in the kitchen, the other servants stared openly. "You shouldn't be working today," Maria, the head cook, scolded, wagging a flour-dusted finger. "The master told you to rest." Amelia shook her head. "There's work to be done. Rest doesn't feed anyone." "You're either braver than the rest of us," muttered a scullery maid, "or foolish." Amelia smiled faintly. "Perhaps both." She picked up a tray, balancing it carefully despite her bandaged hands. Her movements were slower than usual, but steady. The murmurs followed her down the hall, but she paid them no mind. Upstairs in the heart of the mansion, Alexander Huntington sat in his study with a file of contracts spread before him. The leather chair creaked slightly as he leaned back, his gaze unfocused. He had not slept well. The image of Amelia kneeling on the marble floor, blood dripping from her hands, haunted him like an unfinished sentence. He had seen many servants injured in the course of their duties. It had never concerned him before. They were replaceable, their discomfort irrelevant to the balance sheets that truly mattered. But this lingered. Why? He asked himself the question again and again. Why her? Why this? His mind replayed the expression on her face. Not fear, not desperation, but a strange calmness, as if she had chosen the pain. She had acted without expectation, without bargaining, without the usual servile attempt to impress him. She had simply done what needed to be done. The knock at his study door was soft, measured. He straightened in his chair, sliding the contracts into a neat pile. "Enter." The butler appeared, bowing with the precise angle of deference. "Sir, the maid Amelia is working again this morning, despite your order." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Defiance?" "Not defiance, sir," the butler said carefully. "Merely persistence. She insists the house requires her attention." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, almost against his own nature, he murmured, "Let her." The butler blinked, startled. "As you wish, sir." When the door closed, Alexander exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming once against the polished wood of his desk. He did not like the feeling, this strange unease, this unwillingness to exert control. It was as if a hairline crack had formed in the armor he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Later that day, he caught sight of her again. She was in the grand hall, polishing the banisters with methodical care. Despite her bandages, she worked with patience, humming a faint tune under her breath. It was not a melody he recognized, but its simplicity carried an odd weight. He stopped at the base of the staircase. "You disobeyed me!" Amelia startled, straightening quickly. Her cloth dropped from her hand, and she bent to retrieve it with an awkward bow. "Forgive me, sir. I didn't mean—" "I told you to rest," he cut in, his voice low. She lifted her gaze, hesitant yet steady. "With respect, sir, rest is a luxury I cannot afford." His eyes narrowed. "You cannot afford?" She hesitated, as if weighing how much truth she could reveal. "There are always tasks. If I do not do them, someone else must. And if no one does, the house suffers. I would rather bear the burden myself." There was no challenge in her words, no attempt to provoke. Only quiet conviction. Alexander studied her, searching for the fear he was used to. He found none. Instead, he saw determination. Something rare, something unbending. "Your hands," he said abruptly. "Do they pain you?" Her lips curved faintly, almost a smile. "A little. But pain is not the end of the world, sir. It reminds us we are alive." His chest tightened at the unexpected reply. Pain in his world was something to be avoided, denied, hidden. He thought of his father, who had taught him that suffering was weakness, that compassion was liability. Yet here stood a maid who treated pain as proof of life, not defeat. He turned sharply, his coat swirling behind him. "See to your duties," he said, his voice clipped. "Yes, sir," she answered softly, bending again to her work. But as he walked away, Alexander felt the crack widen, as though something within him had shifted, however slightly. He tried to bury the thought beneath numbers and contracts, yet it lingered, persistent as a whisper in the dark. That evening, as the household quieted, he found himself restless. He left his study and wandered through the corridors, his footsteps echoing. Passing the servant quarters, he heard laughter, low, gentle, and warm. Peering through the half-open door of the kitchen, he saw Amelia sharing a crust of bread with another maid, both smiling as if it were a feast. The sight was so simple, so foreign to him, that he felt an ache he could not name. He returned to his chambers unsettled. The image burned into his mind. For the first time in years, Alexander Huntington realized he was no longer the absolute master of his own thoughts. And though he told himself it was nothing, he knew the truth. A maid with bloodied hands and quiet strength had begun to unravel the fortress of ice he had built around his heart. The days that followed carried with them the familiar rhythm of the mansion's silent halls, measured footsteps, the constant hum of labor beneath the glittering surface of wealth. Yet for Alexander, the cadence of life had shifted. The routines remained unchanged, but his attention no longer drifted solely to contracts, balance sheets, and political maneuvers. More and more often, his gaze would find Amelia. She was never idle. Wherever there was a task left undone, she appeared with quiet certainty. In the mornings, she was in the kitchen, hands busy with dishes before the sun had properly risen. In the afternoons, she dusted the endless rows of books in the library, her touch careful even through the bandages that still wrapped her palms. At night, she moved through the halls with a lantern, checking for forgotten tools, discarded linens, any detail that might mar the order of the house. Always steady, always gentle. What unsettled Alexander was not her efficiency. He expected efficiency, but the way she did these things without calculation, without the constant fear that guided the others. The rest of the staff worked with their eyes fixed downward, their movements frantic to avoid mistake. Amelia, though, seemed to carry a kind of peace even when her body was tired. She worked as if labor itself had meaning. He began noticing the smaller moments. One afternoon, he paused at the entrance to the greenhouse and saw Amelia speaking with the old gardener. The man's back was bent with age, his steps slowed by arthritis, but he still tended the roses with devotion. Amelia carried a watering can heavier than her bandaged hands should have managed, pouring carefully into the soil as the gardener gave instructions. She smiled at him with such genuine warmth that for a moment Alexander felt the cold walls of the mansion soften. The next day, passing through the kitchen, Alexander overheard Amelia offering part of her own portion of bread to a younger scullery maid who had missed her meal. "You must eat," Amelia said simply, pressing the slice into the girl's hand. "A hungry stomach cannot carry heavy work." The girl's eyes filled with gratitude. Amelia only laughed softly and returned to her task. Another evening, he saw her sitting on the back steps with the head cook, Maria. The older woman's hands were swollen from years of kneading dough and stirring pots. Amelia massaged them gently, whispering something that made Maria chuckle. The sound of that laughter, so rare in the Huntington household, lingered long after Alexander had returned to his study. The more he observed, the more confused he became. Why would a woman with so little to her name give so much of herself away? She had no wealth, no power, no security. Her mother was sick, her brothers depended on her wages barely covered their needs. And yet she gave time, food, comfort freely, as if kindness was a resource that could not be exhausted. It gnawed at him. In his world, every action was calculated, every move measured by profit and loss. Generosity was a currency used only for influence. But Amelia seemed untouched by such calculations. She gave without thought of return, and in doing so she created something that money could not purchase: trust, affection, loyalty. One evening, as Alexander descended the staircase, he found her polishing the brass rail at the base of the banister. She was humming again, the same faint melody he had heard once before. He paused, his hand resting on the rail above her head. "What is that tune?" he asked abruptly. Amelia startled, nearly dropping her cloth. She glanced up, her dark eyes wide with surprise. "It's nothing, sir. Just a song my mother used to sing." "Why do you sing when you work?" His tone was sharp, though the question was genuine. She hesitated, then said softly, "Because it makes the work lighter, and because silence can be heavy." Silence heavy. The word struck him harder than he expected. This house was full of silence, oppressive, cold, unbroken. He had thought it a sign of discipline, of order. But what if silence was not strength, but emptiness? He studied her face, trying to read it as he would a contract. Yet there was no hidden clause, no deception, only honesty, and something else, something like light. "You believe your singing changes anything?" he asked. Amelia tilted her head, considering. "Perhaps not the house, but it changes me. And sometimes, sir, that is enough." For a moment, Alexander could not reply. The notion that a person's inner state mattered more than the structure of their surroundings was so foreign to him that he almost dismissed it. Yet he could not. The memory of her words followed him long after he had left her in the hall. That night, Alexander sat alone in his study, the fire crackling low. He opened one of the many ledgers that documented his empire. The profits from overseas ventures, the rising value of his stocks, the annual increase in the estate's worth. The numbers were precise, flawless, ordered. Yet for the first time, they looked empty. Cold. His mind drifted to Amelia laughing with Maria, carrying water for the gardener, sharing bread with the maid. Invisible strength. That was what she carried, not the kind that conquered markets, but the kind that endured hardship without bitterness, that created warmth in places designed to be cold. He wondered briefly what it would be like to possess such a strength. When he finally extinguished the fire and prepared for bed, he caught his reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, he did not recognize the certainty in his own eyes. It was as though Amelia's quiet light had revealed shadows he had long refused to see. The mansion remained silent, but Alexander Huntington no longer found comfort in that silence. Somewhere deep within him, the first stirrings of change had begun, fragile and disorienting. And he knew, though he would never admit it aloud, that the cracks in his armor were widening. The Huntington mansion, for all its grandeur, was built on a foundation of rigid discipline. Every hour of the day was accounted for, every role tightly defined, every mistake punished swiftly. It was a house that prided itself on perfection, where error was not tolerated and forgiveness was never spoken of. That evening, when a small accident disturbed the fragile symmetry of Alexander's world, the air grew charged with the familiar dread that always preceded his judgment. The dining hall was alight with the glow of candles set in polished silver. Long tapestries hung heavy on the walls, muting the sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversation. The guests' wealthy neighbors and business associates spoke of investments, charities, and travel with the careful pride of people who wanted Alexander's approval as much as they wanted his fortune. The servants, dressed in crisp uniforms, moved silently among them, refilling glasses and adjusting dishes without drawing attention. Amelia had been assigned to the periphery, quietly ensuring everything ran smoothly. Though her bandages were nearly gone, her hands still carried faint lines from the cuts of shattered crystal. She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure every gesture was neat. The incident began with something so simple it might have passed unnoticed in any other household. A young maid, no more than 16, carried a decanter of red wine to the head of the table. Her hands shook slightly as she poured, the liquid glistening in the firelight. Then in a single nervous twitch, a splash of wine spilled over the edge, staining the pristine white linen. Gasps rose from the servants nearby. The maid froze, her face paling as though she had been caught in a crime. Everyone knew what this meant. Alexander Huntington's gaze fell on the red mark spreading across the cloth. It looked like blood against the snowy surface. His jaw tightened, and his hand pressed flat against the table. The room fell into silence. Even the guests, sensing the weight of the moment, looked on with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. All eyes shifted between the trembling maid and the master, whose judgment could dismiss her with a single word. "Unacceptable," Alexander said at last, his voice low, cold and final. The maid's lips trembled. She tried to speak, but no words came. Before he could say more, another voice rose in the silence. "It was my fault, sir." Amelia had stepped forward. Her tone was steady, respectful, but her words carried clearly across the table. "I should have cleared the table sooner. The linen would not have been ruined if I had done my duty properly." The other servants stared at her in shock. The maid turned to her with wide eyes as though unable to believe what she was hearing. Alexander, however, narrowed his gaze. "You defend incompetence?" Amelia lowered her eyes slightly but did not falter. "I defend humanity, sir. Mistakes happen to us all. Punishment will not prevent them. Only patience and guidance can." The words struck the air like a blow. Never before had anyone in his household spoken to him so directly, and certainly not in defense of another. Alexander felt the heat rise in his chest, not just anger, but something else, something unfamiliar. "You presume to teach me?" His voice was sharp, laced with incredulity. Amelia's dark eyes lifted to meet his. They were calm, unafraid, though her hands were clasped tightly in front of her apron. "No, sir. I presume only to remind you that mercy is not weakness." The silence that followed was deeper than before. The guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch, though every ear strained to catch the master's response. The maid who had spilled the wine stood trembling at Amelia's side, clinging to the hope that her fate might change. Alexander's thoughts churned. For years, his authority had rested on fear. Fear created discipline. Discipline created order. That was the law of the Huntington estate. Yet this woman, this maid, spoke as though kindness held equal strength. And worse, he could not easily dismiss her words, for they rang with a truth he could not ignore. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Never forgive. Weakness invites rebellion." But then another image intruded, the sight of Amelia kneeling on the marble floor, her hands bleeding as she cleaned broken glass without complaint. Her words now, paired with that memory, carved a fissure through the armor he had worn all his life. At last he spoke, his tone colder than he intended, as if trying to shield himself from what he felt. "The tablecloth will be replaced. See to it." The servants blinked in surprise. That was all? No dismissal? No threat? No punishment? The young maid gasped softly, tears of relief springing to her eyes. She bowed deeply and hurried away, carrying the stained cloth with shaking hands. Amelia dipped her head respectfully. "Yes, sir." As she stepped back, Alexander's gaze lingered on her. There was no triumph in her face, no smugness. She had not spoken to challenge him, only to shield another from his wrath. The fire of defiance he had expected was not there. Instead, there was something far more dangerous: conviction. The meal resumed, though the atmosphere never quite recovered its ease. Guests whispered among themselves later, remarking on the strange softness in their host. Among the servants, the story spread before the candles had even been snuffed. Amelia had stood against the master and lived to tell it. That night, Alexander sat in his study, the firelight flickering against the shelves of leather-bound volumes. He poured himself a glass of brandy but left it untouched, staring instead into the flames. Amelia's words repeated in his mind, looping like a refrain he could not silence. Mercy is not weakness. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Mercy in his world was a liability. It invited betrayal, waste, inefficiency. And yet, what if mercy could also be strength? What if patience could create loyalty where fear only bred resentment? He scowled, shaking his head as if to dismiss the notion. He was Alexander Huntington. His empire had been built on discipline, not softness. Still, as the fire crackled low, he could not banish the memory of Amelia's steady eyes, nor the way her presence seemed to ignite something in him he had not felt in years. It was not rebellion she carried. It was fire. A fire that did not burn to destroy, but to warm. And against the ice he had lived in all his life, that fire was beginning to matter. The mansion at night had always been a place of order and silence. Its great halls dimmed, its servants vanished to the wings. For Alexander Huntington, it was the hour of solitude, the time when he retreated to his study, reviewed ledgers, and contemplated the movements of his empire. But lately, the numbers on the page failed to hold his attention. His pen would hover above contracts, his eyes drift from the lines of profit to the memory of words spoken by a maid. Mercy is not weakness. The phrase had gnawed at him for days. He told himself it was nonsense, the sentiment of someone who had never held responsibility, who did not know the weight of leadership. Yet it lingered, as though Amelia's voice had carved it into the walls of his mind. He wanted to dismiss her as naive, yet there was something in her steadiness that made dismissal impossible. It was late when he finally pushed the papers aside. He rose, pacing slowly to the tall windows that overlooked the gardens. The moonlight silvered the hedges, making the fountain gleam like crystal. Somewhere below he heard the faint murmur of voices, softer than the night breeze. His brow furrowed. Few servants lingered past curfew. Curiosity carried him down the staircase, his footsteps soundless against the polished wood. Near the servants' entrance, he paused. Through a half-open door, he saw Amelia speaking with Maria, the cook. Amelia's hands were folded in her lap, her expression calm. "The medicine is expensive," Amelia was saying, her voice low. "But if I take extra hours, perhaps I can send enough this month. My brothers need shoes for school as well. I will manage." Maria clucked her tongue, pressing Amelia's hand gently. "Child, you give too much of yourself. You cannot carry the whole world." Amelia smiled faintly. "Perhaps not, but I can carry my family." Alexander stepped back into the shadows, unseen. His chest tightened at her words. A sick mother. Brothers who needed her. He returned to his study unsettled, sitting heavily in his chair. She bore responsibilities that would crush others, and yet she carried them without bitterness. Her strength was invisible, but undeniable. Memories stirred unbidden in him, memories of his own childhood. He had grown up in this very house, though it had felt less like a home and more like a fortress. His father, stern and exacting, demanded perfection in every lesson, every chore, every word spoken. Mistakes were met not with patience, but with cold silence or cutting rebuke. Alexander's mother had tried, in her quiet way, to soften the edges, but she faded early, consumed by illness and loneliness. He remembered her pale face at the window, watching him practice his recitations with trembling hands. When she died, the house became colder still, and Alexander learned quickly that emotion had no place in the Huntington legacy. He had inherited discipline, yes, wealth, yes, but warmth, never. The contrast struck him now like a blow. He had grown up with everything money could buy, and yet had felt impoverished of love. Amelia, with nothing but her wages and a sick mother, seemed richer in spirit than he had ever been. The next evening, he found her in the library. She was dusting the rows of books, her movements careful, her face serene. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me about your family," Amelia started, turning quickly. "Sir, your family," he repeated. "You speak of them often." Her eyes softened, and a small smile touched her lips. "My mother is unwell, but she is strong in spirit. She prays for us every day, my brothers." They are full of mischief, too clever for their own good, but I hope they will become good men. You hope, he said, his tone more questioning than mocking. But how do you know? Without guidance, children falter. Amelia tilted her head slightly. Guidance is not only rules, sir. It is love. Even in our small home, we have that. My brothers may falter, but they know they are not alone. Alexander's gaze hardened. Love does not feed mouths or pay doctors. Love cannot build empires. Perhaps not, Amelia said gently. But without love, what is the empire for? The question cut deeper than he expected. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsettled by the simplicity of her logic. He had never asked himself what his empire was for. It had always been about power, about survival, about maintaining the name. But what if there was another purpose? Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint rustle of pages as Amelia adjusted a book. Finally, she spoke again, her tone softer. My mother used to say that kindness is like planting seeds. You may not see the tree grow, but one day someone else will rest in its shade. Alexander turned away sharply, pacing toward the fire. The idea both infuriated and fascinated him. Seeds, shade, kindness. These were not the tools of power he had been taught. Yet he could not deny the strength in Amelia's voice when she spoke of them. Do you believe such things change the world? He asked, not looking at her. I believe they change people, she said simply, and people are the world. Her words lingered long after she had gone. That night, Alexander lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in many years, he felt the hollowness of his own life press against him. All his wealth, all his control, and yet he had never known the richness Amelia spoke of. He wondered if perhaps, beneath her humility, she was the strongest person he had ever met. And deep within, where he would not admit it even to himself, he felt the first stirrings of envy. The Huntington estate never slept, though its silence after dusk could fool even the most attentive guest. In the servants' wing, faint murmurs and the clatter of dishes marked the close of another day's labor, while in the main halls the glow of chandeliers dimmed to a warm hush. Alexander usually cherished these hours, his solitude, his fortress of quiet, where no one dared intrude. But lately solitude pressed against him like a weight. He found his steps straying from his study more often, his eyes seeking the places where Amelia might be found. It was under the pretense of a private dinner that he drew her closer. The evening was not marked by the usual cascade of guests or endless courses designed to impress foreign partners. Instead, Alexander had chosen simplicity. A meal for himself in one of the smaller dining rooms. A chamber lined with oil paintings and heavy draperies, where shadows softened the hard edges of the furniture. He had asked Amelia to assist with preparations, an unusual request, for typically the butler or Maria the cook oversaw such tasks. When she arrived, balancing a tray with polished candlesticks, her expression betrayed only mild surprise. "Sir, I was told you required my help." "I did," Alexander said, his voice quieter than usual, almost thoughtful. "I prefer the setting to be precise." She nodded and moved to place the candlesticks on the table. Her hands, though no longer bandaged, bore the faint pink lines of healing cuts. Alexander's eyes lingered on them, remembering the blood on marble, the steadiness of her face as she worked through pain. "Does it hurt still?" he asked. She glanced down, surprised by the question. "Not much. They are only scars now. Scars do not trouble me." His lips curved faintly, almost into a smile. "Scars trouble most people." "They remind me that I endured," she replied simply. He studied her a long moment, then turned his attention back to the table. "Set the silver here," he said, pointing to a place at his right. His tone was firm again, but something in it lacked its usual edge. As they worked, the silence between them grew strange, not heavy but charged. Alexander felt the distance between them in every motion. The brush of her sleeve against his arm as she set down a plate, the quiet sound of her breath as she moved around the table. He had been near countless women of society, dazzling in jewels and laughter, but never had he felt this sense of awareness, this constant pull toward someone so far from his world. When the table was finally arranged, he gestured for her to step back. "Stay," he said abruptly. "I may need adjustments during the meal." Amelia hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. "As you wish, sir," He ate slowly, more conscious of her presence than of the food. At one point, he looked up to find her watching the flicker of candlelight on the silver. There was nothing servile in her expression, only quiet thought, as though she were considering the beauty of the moment for its own sake. "Do you find this house beautiful?" he asked suddenly. Her eyes widened at the question. She looked around the room, the paintings, the carved wood, the glittering chandeliers. "It is. Impressive," she said carefully. "Impressive," he repeated as though testing the word. She hesitated before adding, "But beauty is not only in grandeur. Sometimes beauty is a laugh at the right moment or kindness where none is expected." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. "You believe this house lacks beauty?" Her lips parted, but she did not look away. "I believe it lacks warmth." Silence stretched between them. Alexander felt the old instinct to rebuke, to assert control. Yet he did not. Instead, he found himself unsettled by her honesty, the courage it took to speak so plainly to him. He set down his fork. "You are not afraid to say such things." Her voice was soft but steady. "Fear has never built trust, sir." His chest tightened at her words. Trust. A concept as foreign to him as mercy had been days before. He realized with sudden clarity that she was not merely a servant in his house. She was something far more dangerous. A mirror. She reflected back at him the emptiness he had built his life upon. Later that night, after the table was cleared and the candles extinguished, Amelia lingered near the doorway as if uncertain whether to speak. He noticed the way her hands twisted in her apron, the rare sign of nerves. "Sir," she began cautiously, "forgive me if I overstep, but why ask me for this task tonight? The butler could have done it better." Alexander studied her in the dim light. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he admitted, "Because I wanted to see if silence could be different." Her brow furrowed. "Different, sir?" "Not heavy," he said quietly, his gaze steady on hers. "But alive." Sure. She inhaled softly as though the words carried more weight than she had expected. Then she bowed her head. "Good night, sir." When she left, the room felt emptier than it ever had before. Yet for Amelia, the encounter left her unsettled. As she walked back to her quarters, her thoughts spun with questions she did not want to ask. Why had he looked at her that way? Why had his words sounded less like command and more like confession? She felt a warmth in her chest that frightened her, for she knew too well the danger of allowing her heart to wander where it did not belong. In the servants' wing, whispers had already begun. The staff had seen her summoned to assist with the master's private dinner. They speculated in hushed voices, some curious, others bitter. Amelia ignored them, but inside fear gnawed at her. She could not afford scandal. She could not afford to lose her place here. Her family depended on her. And yet, as she lay awake that night, her thoughts returned again and again to the flicker of candlelight, to his voice when he spoke of silence, to the strange vulnerability she had glimpsed in a man who had once seemed carved from stone. Alexander too lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his chamber. He told himself it was foolishness, that desire was nothing new, that temptation was easily overcome. But what stirred in him was not desire alone. It was something deeper, something he feared more than weakness or loss of control. It was the possibility that Amelia might change him, and that he wanted her to. The summer air hung heavy over the Huntington estate, the gardens lush and green, the fountains sparkling under the sun. To the casual visitor, the house appeared unchanged, still a fortress of order and wealth. Yet within its walls a storm brewed. It began not with raised voices or broken glass, but with whispers. The staff, ever alert to the moods of their master, had noticed his gaze straying too often. They had seen Amelia summoned for small tasks that others might easily have performed. They had seen his silence, once so cold, soften when she spoke, and whispers in a household spread faster than fire. By the time the rumors reached the ears of Alexander's relatives and business associates, they had grown teeth. At a luncheon in the city, a cousin leaned across the table with a smile too sharp to be friendly. "I hear you've developed unusual tastes, Alexander. Mixing business with servants?" Alexander's knife paused over his plate. He lifted his eyes slowly, the weight of his stare enough to silence the cousin. But inside he felt the familiar coil of anger. The Huntington name was not merely wealth, it was reputation, legacy. A stain on it would ripple through every deal, every alliance. The pressure deepened days later when Edward Branson, one of his longest-standing business partners, arrived at the mansion. Branson was a man of Alexander's world-silver hair, sharp suits, a smile honed for boardrooms. They met in the study, brandy glasses set between them. "I'll be blunt, Alexander," Branson said, swirling his drink. "Your household is being watched. People are saying things. You cannot afford softness." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Softness? A servant girl," Branson said with a faint sneer. "Dark-skinned, unrefined. They say you indulge her, that you've lost your edge." The words struck like blows. Alexander leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You presume much." "I presume nothing," Branson replied evenly. "I protect our interests. Appearances matter more than profit sometimes. A Huntington cannot be seen compromising himself over a maid." The meeting ended with stiff courtesy, but Alexander's rage burned long after Branson had gone. He paced the length of his study, the brandy untouched, his mind a battlefield. He had spent his life upholding the Huntington legacy, bending himself to its cold demands. Now, because of one woman's kindness, that legacy threatened to slip. Meanwhile, Amelia felt the storm's touch in more insidious ways. It began with glances from the other servants, curious, sharp, sometimes mocking. In the laundry, one whispered, "Enjoying the master's attention, are you?" Another muttered, "Don't fly too high. The higher you climb, the harder the fall." Amelia pretended not to hear, focusing on her work, but the words stung. The true test came one afternoon when she was called unexpectedly to the front parlor. Waiting for her was not Alexander, but a woman slim, elegant, dressed in silks that shimmered even in the subdued light. Her name was Eleanor, a distant relative of the Huntingtons, and her smile was a predator's mask. "My dear," Eleanor began, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "you must know your place. Alexander is a man of power, and men like him cannot afford distractions." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. "This is more money than you will make in 5 years. Take it and leave quietly. It will be better for everyone, especially for you." Amelia stared at the envelope, her chest tight. The temptation was sharp, her family's medicine, her brother's schooling, the relief from endless struggle. But then she lifted her gaze. Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered. "I am not here to sell myself. I am here to work. If Alexander wishes me gone, he may tell me himself." Eleanor's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of disdain. "You'll regret that," she said coldly, rising to her feet. "This house devours people who forget their place." When Amelia returned to her quarters, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands trembling. The envelope's ghost still lingered in her mind, but she had refused. Not because she trusted Alexander's heart, she did not dare, but because her dignity was not for sale. That evening, Alexander found her in the garden, tending to the roses alongside the old gardener. He noticed the weariness in her face, the tension in her shoulders. "What happened?" he asked. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Your world does not want me here." His jaw tightened. "Who?" "It doesn't matter," she said, shaking her head. "I told them I will not leave unless you wish it." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Alexander felt a surge of protectiveness, sharp and fierce. He had never defended anyone but himself, never cared to. But now the thought of Amelia being pushed out, humiliated, made his chest burn. That night, as he sat once again before the fire in his study, Alexander realized the truth. She was no longer simply a maid in his house. She was a threat to the foundation of everything he had built, and the only person who made him question whether that foundation was worth preserving. Outside, the storm gathered. Inside, another storm raged, quieter, but far more dangerous. The night of the grand banquet arrived with a weight that seemed to press upon every servant in the Huntington estate. It was the kind of event that defined reputations, foreign dignitaries, Prominent financiers and old money families would fill the gilded halls. Every glass, every candle, every thread of linen had to be flawless. The staff moved like dancers, orchestrating perfection under the sharp eye of the butler. Even the air felt heavy, as though the mansion itself anticipated judgment. Alexander prepared in silence, his valet fussing over the fit of his black tailcoat. He gazed at his reflection in the tall mirror, a man carved from iron, his expression unreadable, his posture unyielding. Yet beneath the polished surface, a battle raged. Eleanor's visit to Amelia, Branson's warning, the whispers of the staff all pressed on him. The Huntington legacy demanded strength, discipline, detachment. But Amelia's presence, her steady kindness, her quiet defiance of cruelty, had begun to unravel those chains. Tonight, he would be tested. The banquet hall glowed with hundreds of candles, their flames mirrored in the crystal chandeliers. Guests filed in with laughter and silken gowns, with cufflinks that caught the light and voices honed to the cadence of privilege. The long table gleamed, set with gold-edged china and immaculate linen. Servants moved like shadows, filling glasses, presenting dishes, never daring to interrupt the conversations. Amelia stood among them, her plain uniform stark against the opulence of the evening. She carried herself with calm, her steps precise, her hands steady despite the weight in her chest. She knew eyes followed her more often now, whispers curling in corners. Tonight, she told herself, she would simply work, nothing more. For a time, the banquet unfolded without disruption. The orchestra played softly, courses arrived in elegant succession, and the guests praised Alexander for his impeccable taste. Yet tension hovered like a storm cloud. It broke not with thunder, but with a single cruel voice. Lord Whitmore, a man bloated by both wealth and arrogance, reached for his glass and found it empty. He clicked his tongue sharply, waving his hand. "Girl," he barked, his eyes settling on Amelia. "Wine, quickly." She hurried forward, carrying the decanter with careful grace. As she leaned to pour, Whitmore smirked, his voice loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Tell me, Huntington, is this the creature who occupies so much of your household gossip? A servant dressed like a beggar, and yet I hear she captures your attention better than all the diamonds in New York." The words crashed into the hall, sharper than broken glass. Guests gasped, some stifling laughter behind their napkins. The other servants froze. Amelia stiffened, her hand trembling as she steadied the decanter. Heat rose to her face, her ears burned. She wanted to disappear, but there was no hiding now. Alexander's jaw clenched, but he said nothing at first. Whitmore chuckled, emboldened. He reached out and caught Amelia's wrist, his grip rough. "Perhaps she should sit with us. Tell us, girl, what tricks do you use to tame a man like Huntington?" Amelia's breath caught, her eyes darting downward. She tried to pull free, but Whitmore's grip tightened. Murmurs spread among the guests, shock, amusement, curiosity. Every gaze turned toward Alexander, the master of the house, the Huntington name. His choice now would echo louder than any deal signed or empire built. Time seemed to still. In his mind, Alexander heard his father's voice. Discipline above all. Do not yield to weakness. Appearances must be preserved. He had lived by that creed his entire life. But then he saw Amelia's face, her dignity, her strength, the quiet fire that had carried her through every trial in this house. He saw her humiliation, undeserved, cruelly inflicted, and something in him broke. Alexander rose from his seat. The scrape of his chair against the marble floor cut through the murmurs. Every guest fell silent, his eyes sharp as steel locked on Whitmore. "Release her," he said, his voice low but edged with danger. Whitmore blinked, half amused, half baffled. "Come now, Huntington, surely you don't—" "Release her," Alexander repeated louder now. The command cracked like a whip. Whitmore hesitated, then let go with a mocking laugh. "Have I struck a nerve?" Alexander stepped around the table, his movements deliberate. He placed himself between Amelia and the guest, his tall frame shielding her from further scrutiny. His gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of every guest in turn. "This house," he said, his voice resonant and unflinching, is built on respect. Every person under this roof, servant or guest, is owed dignity. If you cannot honor that, you will not be welcome here." The silence that followed was absolute. Guests stared, wide-eyed, some scandalized, others quietly impressed. No one dared speak. Whitmore flushed crimson, sputtering, but Alexander's stare silenced him. Amelia stood frozen behind him, her heart hammering. No one had ever defended her like this, not with such force, not in front of the powerful men and women who ruled this city. She felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to show weakness now. Alexander turned slightly, his voice softening as he addressed her. "Are you unharmed?" She nodded quickly, though her voice would not come. He gave a single sharp nod, then faced the guests once more. "Enjoy your meal," he said coldly, before escorting Amelia toward the door. The orchestra struck up again hesitantly, conversations resuming in low, uncertain tones. But the damage was done. The story would spread by morning. Alexander Huntington had defended a servant girl, shattering the cold image that had defined him for decades. In the corridor beyond the banquet hall, Amelia stopped, her hands trembling. "Sir, you didn't have to." "Yes," he interrupted firmly. His gray eyes met hers, softer now, though still burning with controlled fire. "I did." For a long moment they stood there, the silence between them alive with unspoken words. Finally, Amelia bowed her head. "Thank you." He nodded once, though gratitude was not what stirred in his chest. It was something heavier, fiercer, a realization that his life, his name, his empire were no longer the only forces guiding him. Tonight he had chosen not discipline, not reputation, but her. And he knew that choice would change everything. The Huntington mansion had weathered many storms, but none like the one that followed the banquet. Within days, the city's social circles were ablaze with scandal. Invitations once freely offered to Alexander were now withheld. Polite smiles at clubs and boardrooms sharpened into whispers. His defense of a servant, a maid no less, was dissected in drawing rooms, scoffed at over cigars, and condemned in the press with veiled jabs about a man too indulgent with his household. And yet, within the mansion itself, something fundamental had shifted. The servants, once cowed and trembling, moved with a new ease. They whispered still, but their whispers carried awe instead of fear. They looked at Amelia differently, as though she carried a shield none of them had ever possessed. More astonishing still, they looked at Alexander differently. He was still their master, still commanding, but no longer untouchable stone. For the first time in years, a current of respect began to replace the rule of dread. Alexander himself felt the change most keenly. In the days after the banquet, he found no peace in his study. The ledgers and contracts lay open, numbers aligned with perfect precision, yet they failed to steady him. His thoughts returned again and again to that moment when he had risen from his chair, when his voice had defended not an empire, but a single woman's dignity. It had been instinctive, fierce, and utterly uncharacteristic. And it had left him changed. He began to notice things he had ignored before. The lines of weariness in Maria's hands as she kneaded dough. The stoop of the butler's shoulders after years of perfect posture. The shadows beneath the eyes of the young maids who worked late into the night. Once he would have dismissed such things as collateral costs of service. Now they weighed on him. One morning, as he passed through the kitchen, he paused to watch Amelia laugh softly with Maria, helping her lift a heavy pot. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "That's enough," he said, his voice gentler than usual. "Maria, take the morning to rest. Amelia, see that she does." Both women stared, stunned. Alexander had never given such an order. Maria, her eyes brimming, whispered, "Thank you, sir," and shuffled away. Amelia turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked quietly when they were alone. He looked at her, the question more difficult than any negotiation he had ever faced. "Because I see now what I should have seen long ago." Amelia lowered her eyes, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe him, yet fear lingered. Men of power often spoke of change, only to return to old ways when the storm passed. Still, she could not deny the difference in his tone. the weight in his gaze. Over the weeks that followed, the transformation continued. Alexander began to listen. He walked the grounds with the gardener, asking about the health of the roses instead of demanding their perfection. He thanked the butler after a long evening of work. He even shared a meal in the kitchen once, sitting among his staff, an act that left them whispering for days. The mansion, once a fortress of silence, began to hum with something new, something dangerously close to warmth. For Amelia, the change was both a gift and a burden. She had seen men bend for convenience, only to harden again when the world pressed back. But Alexander seemed different. He was not softening into weakness, but shifting into something stronger, a man who could command respect without crushing it. And though fear whispered in her that this closeness could destroy her, her heart whispered louder that she was witnessing a man reborn. Their relationship deepened, not through grand declarations, but through quiet moments. A conversation in the library after his evening rounds, where Alexander admitted that his mother's death had left him hollow. A late-night walk in the gardens, where Amelia confessed her fear of failing her family. In these confessions, both found something they had never known: trust. And yet both knew the road ahead was not simple. Society would never forgive Alexander for crossing its invisible boundaries. The Huntington legacy would bear the stain of scandal. Amelia, for her part, feared the weight of being drawn into a world where she could never belong. Their love, unspoken but undeniable, was no fairy tale. It was a choice. One evening, Alexander found her in the great hall, gazing up at the crystal chandelier. He approached quietly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. "You've changed this house," he said softly. Amelia turned, startled. No, sir. You've changed it." He shook his head. "You lit the fire. I only followed its warmth." She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "And what of the world beyond these walls? They will not forgive you for this." His gaze held hers, unwavering. "Let them whisper. I have spent my life earning their approval and found it empty. Now, for the first time, I choose for myself." Her breath caught. The words were dangerous, reckless even, but in them she heard truth. He reached for her hand. For a moment, she hesitated, her mind screaming of consequences, of scandal, of the fragile line she had walked since entering this house. But then she let her fingers slip into his. The silence of the hall was no longer heavy. It was alive. The Huntington mansion, once a symbol of ice, now carried the warmth of laughter in its corridors. The echo of voices no longer trembling. And at its heart stood a man and a woman, bound not by power or wealth, but by the simple, defiant choice to see one another fully. Alexander Huntington, once master of control, had spoken the words he never thought possible. "For the first time in my life, I want to be just a man, not a name, not an empire, just a man, with you." And Amelia, whose kindness had sown seeds in the coldest of soil, finally allowed herself to believe that even in a world built on stone, love could grow. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Tap on the screen to watch the next chapter and dive deeper into stories even more unbelievable than this one. And share this video with your friends. Let them discover the twists they won't believe until they see for themselves.